There's a special kind of heartbreak that comes from losing someone who knew you before the world changed you. It's the grief of losing not just a person, but the version of yourself that only existed in their eyes. King Aldric carried this weight for 30 years. Once he had been just a boy with dreams, loved by a girl who saw his gentle heart beneath the warrior's training. Now he ruled a kingdom respected and feared, but the throne felt cold without her warmth beside him. One autumn morning, a woman in a crimson cloak appeared at his castle gates. Her voice, soft yet strong, carried words that stopped his world. "Do you know me now, Alpha?" she asked, lowering her hood. Elira, his childhood love thought lost to war and time. Can two hearts weathered by decades apart still beat as one? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The dawn light filtered through the tall windows of the great hall, casting long shadows across the stone floor where King Aldric stood alone. At 53, his shoulders bore more than just the weight of his ceremonial armor. They carried 30 years of decisions that had shaped a kingdom, and memories of choices that had shaped a man. His fingers absently turned the heavy gold signet ring on his right hand, the royal seal that had belonged to his father and his father before him. The intricate engravings had worn smooth in places from decades of use, just as the responsibilities of kingship had worn smooth the edges of the boy he'd once been. The ring was more than jewelry. It was a shackle of gold that bound him to duty above all else. "Your Majesty," came the familiar voice of Marcus, his chief advisor, as footsteps echoed across the hall. Marcus was a man of 62, his hair silver white, and his back slightly bent from years spent poring over scrolls and ledgers. Yet his mind remained sharp as any blade, and his loyalty to the crown unwavering. "The morning reports await your review." Aldric turned from the window, where he'd been watching the sun paint the courtyard in shades of amber and gold. "Any urgent matters, old friend?" "The usual concerns, sire. Tax collection from the eastern provinces, a dispute between merchants in the capital market, and—" Marcus paused, his weathered features creasing with concern. "There's been talk among the servants about yesterday's visitor, the woman in the crimson cloak." Even now, hours after her appearance at the gates, Aldric felt his heart quicken at the memory. Her voice had carried across the years like a song half-remembered, stirring something deep within his chest that he'd thought buried forever. What manner of talk? Aldric asked, though he suspected he already knew. Curiosity, mostly. "It's been many years since an unannounced visitor has requested audience with your Majesty. Captain Gareth reports she carries no weapons, bears no obvious threat, yet something about her presence has the guards unsettled." Captain Gareth, another constant in Aldric's life. The man had served as his personal guard for 25 years, rising through the ranks, not through noble birth, but through unwavering courage and an almost supernatural ability to sense danger. Where Marcus protected the king's mind, Gareth protected his body, and both had earned their place through blood and loyalty. "Have you seen her yourself?" Aldric asked, moving toward his throne. Not to sit, for the morning was too restless for that, but to stand behind it, his hands resting on the carved armrests his ancestors had worn smooth. "Briefly, sire. She waits in the South Tower guest chambers, as you instructed. There's something familiar about her, though I cannot place it. Her bearing suggests noble birth, yet her clothing speaks of long travels and modest means." Aldric closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to remember. Elira had always carried herself with quiet dignity, even as a child. The daughter of his father's stablemaster, she'd possessed an intelligence that shone brighter than her humble station might suggest. In another life, in another world, such things wouldn't have mattered. But kings didn't marry stable masters' daughters, no matter how their hearts might yearn. "Sire?" Marcus's voice drew him back to the present. "Shall I have Captain Gareth escort her to the Great Hall for a formal audience?" The Great Hall, where matters of state were conducted, where the weight of the crown pressed heaviest, where King Aldric reigned supreme, but the boy who'd once loved a stable master's daughter had no place at all. "No," Aldric said quietly. "I'll receive her in the garden." "The private one, beyond the east wing." Marcus raised an eyebrow. "A luxury only old friendship could afford in the presence of royalty." "The garden, sire. That's rather informal, yes. Sometimes informality serves us better than ceremony, don't you think?" It was in that same garden, 34 years ago, that a 13-year-old prince had first kissed a 12-year-old girl beneath the apple blossoms. It was there they'd carved their initials into the bark of an old oak tree, dreaming of futures that seemed as endless as the summer sky. It was there, too, that they'd said their farewells when duty called him to war and her to safety in the countryside. The garden had remained largely unchanged, his one concession to sentimentality in a life governed by pragmatism. The apple trees had grown taller, their branches now forming a canopy that filtered sunlight into dancing patterns on the grass below. The oak tree still stood, weathered but strong, its bark long since grown over the young lover's carvings. "Very well, Your Majesty. Shall I accompany you?" "That won't be necessary, but have Captain Gareth position himself nearby, discreetly." "And Marcus?" Aldric met his advisor's eyes. "Whatever transpires in that garden today remains between these walls." Marcus nodded slowly. He'd served 3 kings, had weathered palace intrigues and political storms that would have broken lesser men. If anyone understood the delicate balance between public duty and private pain, it was he. As Marcus departed to make the necessary arrangements, Aldric remained in the great hall, surrounded by the trappings of power that felt increasingly hollow with each passing year. Tapestries depicting his military victories adorned the walls: the Battle of Thornfield, the Siege of Raven's Hollow, campaigns that had expanded his kingdom's borders and secured its future. Yet what good were victories when they came at the cost of everything that made victory worthwhile? The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd spent 30 years building a legacy for children he'd never had, protecting a kingdom whose throne felt more like a prison with each passing day. The marriage proposals came regularly, alliances offered through daughters of neighboring kingdoms, each one a strategic opportunity to strengthen his realm. He'd considered them all, weighed their merits with the cold calculation that kingship demanded. Yet none had moved him to action, perhaps because none of them had whispered his name the way Elira once had. Back when his name was simply Aldric and not Your Majesty or Sire or My King, back when he was loved for who he was, rather than feared for what he could do. The morning sun climbed higher, warming the stone floors and chasing away the dawn chill. Soon he would walk through those garden paths again, would face the ghost of his own past made flesh. The boy in him trembled with anticipation. The king in him steeled for whatever pain or joy the encounter might bring. For now, though, he stood in his great hall, a solitary figure dwarfed by the vastness of a room designed to display royal power. The crown rested heavy on his brow, the signet ring cold against his finger, and somewhere in the South Tower, a woman in a crimson cloak waited to ask him if he remembered who he used to be. He remembered. God help him, he remembered everything. She stood beneath the apple tree where they'd once carved their names, her back to the garden path, crimson cloak draped around shoulders that held themselves with a strength he didn't remember from their youth. The morning breeze stirred the fabric, and for a moment Aldric could almost believe he was dreaming, that the weight of 3 decades hadn't settled between them, like stones in still water. "You came," Elira said without turning around, her voice carrying that same melodic quality that had haunted his quieter moments for 30 years. "Did you doubt I would?" Aldric stopped several paces behind her, close enough to catch the scent of lavender that still clung to her hair, distant enough to maintain the careful space that royalty demanded. She turned then, and the breath caught in his throat. Time had touched her, yes. There were lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and sorrow in equal measure, silver threads woven through hair that had once been the color of autumn wheat. But those eyes, deep brown and knowing, remained exactly as he remembered them. "The boy I knew would have run to me the moment he heard I'd returned," she said, a gentle smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "The king I wasn't certain about." I am both, it seems, though the balance grows more difficult with each passing year. She reached into the folds of her cloak and withdrew a small leather journal, its covers worn smooth by countless hands. "Do you remember this?" Aldric's heart stumbled. He'd given her that journal for her 15th birthday, the last gift before their worlds had been torn apart by war and duty. "You kept it?" "I kept everything." Elira opened the journal carefully, revealing pressed flowers between pages, covered in a young girl's careful script. "The apple blossoms from our first kiss. The 4-leaf clover you found for luck the day before you left for training. Even this." She turned to a page near the back, where 2 names were written in faded ink, Aldric and Elira, surrounded by hearts drawn in different-colored inks. The sight of their younger selves' dreams, preserved in pressed flowers and childish drawings, nearly undid him. "Elira, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted gently. "That I should have forgotten. That holding on to the past serves no purpose. That we're not children anymore, playing at love in secret gardens, aren't we?" The words escaped before he could stop them, carrying more longing than any king should allow himself to feel. She closed the journal, cradling it against her chest like a prayer book. "The war that took you away from me, it took me away too, just in a different direction. My father sent me to my aunt's estate in the northern provinces when the fighting reached our borders. I was supposed to stay for a few months until the danger passed, but you never came back. I couldn't." Pain flickered across her features, there and gone like candlelight in wind. "The estate was attacked 6 months after I arrived. Raiders from across the northern border, looking for easy targets while your armies were engaged elsewhere. They killed my aunt, burned the house, took what they wanted and destroyed the rest." Aldric's hands clenched into fists. "I never knew." "The reports said the northern provinces had been secured. They were eventually, but not soon enough for my aunt, not soon enough for dozens of others who died, while help was still days away." She met his eyes, and he saw not accusation there, but weary acceptance. "I survived by hiding in the root cellar for 3 days. When I finally emerged, there was nothing left. No home, no family, no way back to the life I'd known. Why didn't you send word?" "I would have—" "What? Abandoned your duties to search for a stable master's daughter? Left your kingdom to fend for itself while you played at rescue?" Elira shook her head. "I was 17, Aldric, but I wasn't foolish. I knew what you were becoming, what the crown demanded of you. How could I add my troubles to burdens that were already breaking your back?" The truth of it settled between them, like a weight neither could lift. He had been drowning in responsibility even then, learning statecraft, leading his first military campaigns, carrying his father's expectations and his kingdom's future on shoulders barely broad enough to bear them. "If he'd known she needed him, so I made my own way," Elira continued. "I found work in the northern settlements, learned to be useful with more than just horses. I discovered I had a gift for languages, for trade negotiations. I spent years moving from town to town, hiring myself out as a translator and mediator. It was a good life in its way, lonely but good. Yet you returned." Something shifted in her expression, a hardening that reminded him she was no longer the sheltered girl who'd once braided flowers in her hair. "I returned because staying away would have been selfish. Because there are things you need to know, truths that have been kept from you for far too long." A chill ran down Aldric's spine that had nothing to do with the morning air. "What truths?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps interrupted them. Captain Gareth appeared at the garden's edge, his scarred face set in the careful neutrality he wore when delivering unwelcome news. "Your Majesty," Gareth said with a respectful bow. "Forgive the interruption, but you're needed in the council chamber." "There's been word from the eastern borders, urgent word." Aldric cursed silently. The eastern borders had been quiet for months, which in his experience usually meant trouble was brewing just out of sight. "What word?" "Reports of organized raiding parties, sire. They've hit 3 villages in the past week, but these aren't random attacks. The raiders are too well coordinated, too well informed about local defenses. Lord Commander Hayes believes we may be looking at the advanced scouts for a larger force." The weight of the crown pressed down harder, as it always did when the kingdom's safety hung in the balance. Aldric looked at Elira, saw understanding in her eyes, the same understanding that had allowed her to let him go 30 years ago without making him choose between love and duty. "Go," she said quietly. "Your people need their king. This conversation isn't finished, I know. I'll be here when your duties allow." Gareth cleared his throat. "Begging your pardon, your majesty, but the lady mentioned truths that needed telling. If these raids are connected to older concerns, perhaps she should accompany you to the council meeting." Aldric frowned. Gareth wasn't given to flights of fancy or meaningless suggestions. If he thought Elira's knowledge might be relevant to current threats, "What do you know about these raids?" Aldric asked her. Elira's grip tightened on her journal. "More than I'd like to admit. The organization you're seeing, the detailed knowledge of local defenses. I've seen this pattern before. In the northern provinces, before the attack on my aunt's estate. Before a dozen other attacks that were blamed on random raiders, but felt like something much more coordinated. You think they're connected?" "I think," Elira said carefully, "that someone has been playing a very long game. Someone who knows your kingdom's weaknesses because they helped create some of them." The garden suddenly felt too small, too exposed. Whatever secrets Elira carried, whatever truths she'd returned to reveal, they were larger and more dangerous than a simple reunion between childhood lovers. "Then you'll come with us," Aldric decided. "If you have information that might protect my people—" "Our people," Elira corrected softly. "This was my home once too, remember? These are my people as much as yours, whatever I've become in the years between." As they walked back toward the castle proper, Gareth falling into step behind them, Aldric couldn't shake the feeling that the ground beneath his feet had shifted in ways he didn't yet understand. The woman beside him was both the girl he'd loved and a stranger shaped by experiences he'd never shared, carrying knowledge that might save or damn them all. The council chamber awaited, along with reports of organized raids and threats that felt too coordinated to be coincidental. But beneath the immediate crisis lay deeper questions, older wounds, and truths that had been 30 years in the telling. Whatever came next, Aldric knew his carefully ordered world was about to change in ways he couldn't control or predict. The only question was whether the man he'd become was strong enough to bear whatever revelations awaited, and whether the love he'd never forgotten was real, enough to survive the truth still to come. The council chamber buzzed with tension as maps were spread. Across the great oak table and reports shuffled between weathered hands. Lord Commander Hayes, a grizzled veteran with more scars than unmarked skin, pointed to red marks indicating the most recent attacks, while Marcus took careful notes and Gareth stood watchful by the door. "The pattern is clear, Your Majesty," Hayes said, his gravelly voice carrying the weight of 40 years spent defending the realm. "These aren't desperate bandits looking for quick coin. Each attack has been precisely targeted, hitting grain stores before harvest, disrupting trade routes at peak season, striking at the exact moments when damage would be most costly." Aldric studied the map, noting the locations Hayes had marked. The attacks formed a rough circle around the kingdom's eastern approaches, probing defenses without committing to any single major assault. "They're testing us." "Aye, sire. Looking for weaknesses, timing our response rates, learning how we deploy our forces," which suggests a larger force gathering somewhere beyond our immediate sight, Marcus added, his quill scratching across parchment as he recorded details. "The question becomes, where are they marshalling and what do they ultimately want?" All eyes turned to Elira, who had been studying the map in thoughtful silence since entering the chamber. She'd drawn her cloak closer around herself, but her attention remained fixed on the patterns of red marks scattered across the eastern borders. "This formation," she said finally, tracing a finger along an invisible line connecting several attack sites. "I've seen it before. Not the exact same locations, obviously, but the same strategic approach. Probing attacks in a crescent pattern, designed to force defenders to spread thin while gathering intelligence about response times and troop movements." Where did you see this before? Aldric asked. The northern provinces 15 years ago. A series of raids that everyone blamed on desperate refugees from the border wars. But the pattern was too sophisticated, too well planned for starving refugees to execute. Elira's voice grew quiet, distant. It was the same strategy used in the attacks that destroyed my aunt's estate. Hayes leaned forward, interest sharpening his features. You think the same group is responsible for both sets of attacks? 15 years apart. Not the same group necessarily, but the same mind behind them. The same strategic thinking, the same patient approach to warfare. Elira met Aldric's eyes across the table. Someone who understands this kingdom's defenses from the inside. Someone who knows exactly how you think, how you'll respond to threats. A chill settled over the chamber. The implications hung unspoken but clear. They were facing an enemy who knew them too well, who could predict their moves before they made them. Who? Aldric asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. Elira hesitated, her fingers worrying the edge of her cloak. I need to be certain before I make accusations that could tear your kingdom apart. Give me quarters in the castle for a few days. Let me examine your military records, your reports from the northern provinces. If you're right, then what? Marcus interrupted, his scholarly patience fraying under the stress of unknown threats. We have an enemy who's been planning against us for 15 years. Someone with intimate knowledge of our defenses and strategies? If I'm right, Elira said steadily, then you have an enemy who should be dead. Someone who's been playing a game so long and so carefully that he's had time to turn your own strengths against you. Aldric felt something cold settle in his stomach. The way she said it, the certainty beneath her careful words, suggested this wasn't speculation, but knowledge she'd carried for far too long. Your Majesty, Gareth spoke from his position by the door, his weathered face troubled. If the lady has information about threats to the kingdom, perhaps she should share it fully rather than speaking in riddles. It's not that simple, Elira replied. Some truths require proof, Captain. Some accusations once made cannot be taken back. Then find your proof, Aldric decided. Marcus, see that Lady Elira is given access to whatever records she needs. Assign her quarters in the East Wing, with appropriate escort and protection. Lady Elira. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Sire, I'm not certain. She was born on these lands, served this kingdom's interests in her own way for 30 years, and now brings intelligence that could save lives. That makes her nobility enough for my purposes. Aldric's tone brooked no argument. Captain Gareth, double the patrols along the eastern borders, but do it quietly. I don't want to panic the populace or telegraph our concerns to whoever is watching. Hi, Your Majesty. As the council meeting dissolved into smaller groups planning tactical responses, Aldric found himself walking the castle corridors with Elira beside him. The afternoon sun slanted through tall windows, casting familiar patterns of light and shadow that hadn't changed since their youth. You didn't have to give me a title, Elira said as they climbed the stairs toward the guest quarters in the East Wing. Didn't I? Try moving freely through a royal castle as a commoner and see how far you get. The title makes things simpler for everyone. They paused at a window overlooking the practice yards, where young knights trained with wooden swords under the watchful eyes of their instructors. The sound of clacking wood and shouted corrections drifted up to them, unchanged from the days when a young prince had learned his own lessons in combat. Do you remember that summer when you insisted on learning swordplay? Elira asked, a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. I remember you laughing at my footwork. I remember you being terrible at it initially, then improving so fast it frightened everyone around you. She turned to face him, and for a moment the years seemed to fall away. You always had that gift, the ability to transform challenge into mastery through sheer stubborn determination. Some would call it obsession. Some would call it strength. The kind of strength that builds kingdoms and protects the people who live in them. They continued up the stairs in comfortable silence, but Aldric could feel the weight of unspoken words between them. So many questions remained unanswered, so many conversations interrupted by duty and circumstance. "The quarters here are comfortable," he said as they reached the East Wing landing. "Marcus will have servants bring whatever you need. Clothing, books, writing materials. Thank you." She paused at the door to what would be her temporary home. "Aldric, what I said about truths that could tear the kingdom apart, I meant it. If I'm wrong about what I suspect, the accusations themselves could cause more damage than whatever threat we're actually facing. And if you're right, if I'm right, then someone very close to you has been your enemy for far longer than you could imagine. Someone who's been patient enough to wait decades for the perfect moment to strike." The implications sent ice through his veins. "Someone in my inner circle? Someone who should be dead," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone whose death you mourned, whose loss shaped the man you became." Before he could press for details, she slipped inside her chambers, leaving him standing in the corridor with more questions than answers. The afternoon sun continued its westward journey, casting longer shadows as the day progressed toward evening. Aldric returned to his own quarters, but found no peace there among the familiar furnishings and royal trappings. His private study, lined with books and maps and the accumulated wisdom of 30 years of rule, felt suddenly insufficient. How could a lifetime of knowledge and experience mean nothing when faced with an enemy who knew him too well, who had been planning his downfall since before he'd fully understood what he had to lose? That evening, as he stood on his balcony watching the sun set over his kingdom, Aldric thought about the strange turns of fate that had brought Elira back to him at the exact moment when her knowledge might save everything he'd built. Coincidence or something more deliberate? Either way, the girl who'd once carved her name beside his in an apple tree's bark had returned as a woman who might hold the keys to his kingdom's survival. Whether that knowledge would preserve his crown or destroy it remained to be seen. In the distance, the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, and somewhere beyond his borders, an enemy with his face waited in the shadows. Patient as death itself, 3 days had passed since Elira's arrival, and the castle had settled into an uneasy rhythm around her presence. Servants whispered in corridors about the mysterious lady who spent her days buried in military records, and her evenings walking the garden paths alone. Some of the older staff claimed to remember a stable master's daughter from decades past. Though none dared speak such speculation aloud, Aldric found himself drawn to those same garden paths each morning, where he would inevitably encounter Elira reviewing documents or simply sitting in contemplative silence. Their conversations had grown more comfortable, the rigid formality of their first reunion gradually giving way to something warmer, more familiar. "The marriage proposal from Valdris arrived this morning," Aldric mentioned, as they walked among the roses on the 4th day. The messenger had been insistent, carrying not just documents, but gifts of rare silk and precious stones, intended to demonstrate King Rodric's serious intentions regarding an alliance sealed through matrimony. Elira's step faltered slightly. "Valdris is a prosperous kingdom. Their princess is said to be both beautiful and intelligent." "Yes, I'm told Princess Catherine is everything a king could want in a bride." He paused at a bench carved from white marble, the same bench where they'd shared their first tentative conversations about love so many years ago. "She's also 23 years old. You say that as if it matters, doesn't it?" "I'm 53, Elira, old enough to be her father, with grey in my beard and scars on my hands that she'll never understand." "What kind of marriage is that?" Elira settled beside him on the bench, careful to maintain the proper distance that court protocol demanded, even in private. "The kind that secures alliances, strengthens kingdoms, and produces heirs to carry on your legacy. The kind that kings make every day. The kind my father made." Aldric's voice carried bitter memories. "He married my mother for her family's wealth and political connections. They were courteous to each other, respectful, dutiful, but I never once saw them touch, except for ceremonial occasions. Never heard them laugh together or share a private joke, yet they produced a son who became a good king." "Did they? Or did they produce a man so terrified of ending up in a loveless marriage that he spent 30 years finding excuses to avoid it entirely. The question hung between them, weighted with implications neither quite dared to address directly. In his private chambers, hidden away in a drawer he rarely opened, lay a pressed flower, the only remnant he'd kept from their youth. A reminder of what love could feel like when it wasn't calculated on the basis of political advantage or military alliance. Aldric, I know what you're going to say. That duty must come before personal desire, that the needs of the kingdom outweigh the wants of the heart. You've always been wiser than I am about such things. Have I? Elira's voice was soft, uncertain. Because standing here now, watching you carry burdens I never could have imagined when we were young, I wonder if wisdom is just another word for cowardice. He looked at her then, really looked, seeing not just the girl he'd remembered, but the woman she'd become. The years had marked her with a strength that didn't exist in smooth skin or youthful curves. A depth that spoke of challenges faced and overcome, rather than avoided. You weren't a coward when you let me go without making me choose, wasn't I? Perhaps if I'd been braver, if I'd fought for what we had, instead of accepting what seemed inevitable, the kingdom would have suffered for it. My father would have found ways to remove you from my life, possibly permanently. And I would have been torn between love and duty in ways that would have destroyed both. So instead, we both chose suffering of a different kind. 30 years of wondering what might have been. Their eyes met, and for a moment the careful distance between them seemed unnecessary, even cruel. Aldric found himself remembering not just the girl she'd been, but the way she'd made him feel, whole in ways he'd never managed to recapture. Despite a lifetime of trying, the moment was interrupted by approaching footsteps. Marcus appeared on the garden path, his expression troubled in ways that had nothing to do with interrupted private conversations. Your Majesty, Lady Elira. He greeted them with a formal bow. Forgive the intrusion, but we've received another report from the eastern borders. This one requires immediate attention. Aldric straightened, the warm intimacy of the moment dissolving into familiar duty. What news? The village of Millhaven was attacked last night, but this wasn't like the previous raids. They took hostages rather than just supplies. 23 people, including the village elder's daughter, hostages. Elira stood quickly, her face pale. That changes everything. They're escalating, moving from probing attacks to direct provocations. My thoughts exactly, my lady. But there's more. Marcus glanced between them, clearly uncomfortable with whatever he was about to reveal. The raiders left a message, carved into the door of the village hall. What message? The true king remembers his own, and below it a symbol we haven't seen in 30 years, the royal seal of Prince Demon. The color drained from Aldric's face. Demon, his younger brother, dead these 30 years at the Battle of Thornfield. Killed, according to all reports, while leading a desperate charge against enemy forces that had threatened to overwhelm their left flank. His body had never been recovered from that bloody field, but neither had dozens of others who'd fallen in the chaos of combat. That's impossible, Aldric said, but his voice lacked conviction. Demon died at Thornfield. I saw him fall. You saw him charge into battle and disappear in the fighting, Elira corrected quietly. His body was never found, never identified among the dead. You're suggesting my brother has been alive for 30 years. That he's behind these attacks? Aldric's voice rose, drawing sharp looks from nearby gardeners. He lowered it to a harsh whisper. Demon was ambitious, yes, but he wasn't a traitor. He wouldn't he? Elira's voice was gentle but implacable. Think about it, Aldric. Who else would know your strategies well enough to counter them? Who else would understand the kingdom's defenses from the inside? Who else would have motivation to wait decades for the perfect moment to strike? The implications crashed over him like cold water. If Demon was alive, if he'd been the one behind the attacks, not just the recent ones, but going back 15 years to the raids that had destroyed Elira's life in the northern provinces, then everything Aldric thought he knew about his past was built on lies. There's something else, Marcus continued reluctantly. The hostages, they weren't chosen randomly. Among them is Lord Garrett's son, the mayor's wife. and 3 others with direct connections to families that opposed Prince Daemon's military appointments before the war. "He's settling old scores," Elira murmured, "taking revenge on people who crossed him decades ago, or he's building leverage for something bigger," Aldric said, his mind racing through implications. "Daemon always understood that power came as much from who you could threaten as from who you could reward, Your Majesty," Marcus said carefully. "If Prince Daemon is indeed alive, if he's building a force to challenge your rule, we need to respond quickly and decisively. Every day we delay gives him more time to prepare, more opportunities to strike at our vulnerabilities." Aldric nodded, but his thoughts were chaos. Daemon alive, his brother, who he'd mourned for 30 years, who he'd honored with monuments and prayers and the kind of grief that never fully healed, alive and leading attacks against the kingdom they'd both sworn to protect. "Send word to all border garrisons," he decided. "Double the patrols, but quietly. I want intelligence on any unusual activity beyond our borders, any signs of a larger force gathering. And Marcus, send envoys to our allies. If Daemon is planning something significant, we'll need support." "What about the marriage proposal from Valdris?" Marcus asked. "King Roderick expects an answer soon." Aldric glanced at Elira, saw something shift in her expression, resignation mixed with understanding. The kind of look that said she'd always known this moment would come, when duty would triumph over desire once again. "Tell King Roderick I'm considering his proposal favorably," Aldric said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "An alliance with Valdris could be crucial if we're facing a prolonged conflict. And the Lady Elira, her research into these patterns could prove invaluable if Prince Daemon is indeed behind the attacks." "Lady Elira will continue her research," Aldric replied, not looking at her. "Her knowledge of these tactics could save lives." As Marcus departed to carry out his orders, Aldric and Elira remained in the garden, the afternoon sun casting long shadows between them. The easy warmth of their earlier conversation had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of choices that couldn't be unmade. "A political marriage to secure military alliance," Elira said eventually. "It's the smart choice. The right choice for a king facing an existential threat. Is it? Or is it just the safe choice? The one that doesn't require me to risk anything that matters? Your kingdom matters. Your people matter. And you?" The question escaped before he could stop it, carrying 30 years of suppressed longing. "Do you matter?" Elira turned away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I matter enough to want you to make the choices that will keep you safe, keep your kingdom strong. Even if those choices don't include me, they could," he said quietly. "The choices could include you, if I were brave enough to make them, brave enough or foolish enough." She faced him again, and he saw tears she refused to shed. "Aldric, I came back to warn you about Daemon, to help you face whatever threat he represents. I didn't come back to complicate your life or make your choices harder. Maybe I needed them to be harder. Maybe I needed someone to remind me that there are things worth fighting for, beyond just duty and obligation." The words hung between them like a bridge neither quite dared to cross. In the distance, the sound of evening bells began to ring across the castle grounds, calling them back to their separate worlds, he to the crown that defined him, she to the uncertain role of ally and advisor in a game whose rules neither of them fully understood. Tomorrow would bring new reports from the borders, new decisions about alliances and marriages, and the delicate balance between personal desire and royal duty. But for now, in the fading afternoon light of a garden that remembered their younger selves, they stood together on dangerous ground, knowing that one wrong step could change everything. The Queen's crown of thorns sat in its glass case in the royal treasury, a masterpiece of goldwork and precious stones that had adorned the heads of Aldric's mother and grandmother before her. Unlike the king's crown, with its bold assertions of power and authority, the Queen's crown spoke of different truths, the delicate balance between beauty and pain, the sacrifices required of those who loved rulers rather than simply serving them. Aldric stood before the case in the pre-dawn darkness. unable to sleep for the third consecutive night. The crown's rubies caught the torchlight like drops of blood, each stone a reminder of the prices paid by royal women throughout the centuries. His mother had worn it on her wedding day, and on the day she'd birthed him, and on the day she'd been laid to rest after a fever that no amount of royal power could cure. "She was beautiful," came Elira's voice from behind him. "Your mother. I remember seeing her at festivals when we were children. She always looked so elegant, so perfectly composed, Aldric didn't turn around. He'd grown accustomed to finding Elira in unexpected places throughout the castle. The library at midnight, the chapel at dawn, the battlements when storm clouds gathered. She moved through his domain like a ghost of his own making, present but not quite belonging. "She was lonely," he replied, "elegant and composed and utterly, completely lonely. My father respected her, provided for her, honored her in all the ways that protocol demanded. But he never loved her, not the way she deserved to be loved. How do you know? Because I watched her face when she thought no one was looking. Because I heard her crying in her chambers when my father was away on hunting trips or diplomatic missions. Because she told me on her deathbed that the greatest regret of her life was accepting a crown that came without a heart attached." Elira moved to stand beside him, her reflection joining his in the glass that separated them from the crown. "Is that why you've avoided marriage all these years? Fear of recreating your parents' mistake?" "Partially." He finally looked at her, seeing his own exhaustion reflected in her features. "Also because I knew what love felt like once. I knew the difference between duty and desire, between a political arrangement and something real. How do you settle for less when you've experienced more? People do it every day. They make practical choices, find contentment in stability and companionship instead of passion. Could you? Could you marry someone you respected but didn't love? Share your bed and your life and your dreams with someone who saw you as a valuable acquisition rather than an irreplaceable person?" The question hung between them, more personal than anything they'd discussed since her return. Elira's fingers traced patterns on the glass case, avoiding his gaze. "I don't know," she admitted. "I've never had to face that choice. For 30 years, I've been free to refuse any man who didn't stir my heart, because I had no kingdom to consider, no dynasty to preserve. Freedom," Aldric said with bitter humor. "I'd forgotten what that word meant. You still have choices, Aldric. You're not your father, and this isn't 30 years ago. You could refuse King Rodric's proposal, could find another way to secure the alliance you need. Could I? With demon gathering forces, with threats multiplying at our borders, with my advisors already whispering about the kingdom's need for stability and succession." He pressed his palm against the glass, the cool surface reflecting his heat back at him. "Sometimes I think the crown chooses us rather than the other way around. That we become kings, not through ambition, but through the slow accumulation of choices we can't unmake. And if you could unmake them, if you could step away from all of this, what would you choose?" The answer came without hesitation, spoken to her reflection rather than her face, because looking at her directly would have been too much. "You. I would choose you, as I should have 30 years ago. I would choose love over duty, passion over politics. The woman who sees my heart over the princess, who sees my crown." Elira's breath caught, and for a moment the only sound in the treasury was the distant drip of water somewhere in the castle's depths. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "And I would choose you. Not the king, not the crown, not the power or the palace or any of the things that come with loving royalty. Just you, the boy who carved our names in tree bark and promised me we'd find a way to be together always. Then why does it feel impossible? Because we're not children anymore. Because the choices we make now affect thousands of people beyond ourselves. Because," she turned away from the crown case, facing him directly for the first time. "Because Demon's return changes everything. If he's building an army, if he's planning to challenge your rule, then you need every advantage you can gather, including a military alliance with Valdris. So I should marry Princess Catherine for the sake of 10,000 soldiers and her father's treasury." You should marry her, because refusing might cost you everything you've spent 30 years building. Your kingdom, your people's safety, the stability that's allowed merchants to prosper and children to grow up without knowing war. And what about us? What about what we've found again? Elira's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. We'll have what we've always had. Memories of what could have been, and the knowledge that sometimes love means letting go. I can't, Aldric began, but his words were interrupted by urgent footsteps in the corridor outside. Marcus appeared in the treasury doorway, his face grim with news that couldn't wait for proper morning audiences. "Your Majesty, Lady Elira," he said, slightly breathless from hurrying through the castle. "Forgive the early hour, but there's been a development. Captain Gareth has returned from the eastern borders with intelligence that changes our entire understanding of the threat we face." "What intelligence?" Aldric asked, though part of him already dreaded the answer. "Prince Demon isn't just gathering raiders and bandits, sire. He's built a legitimate army, 3,000 men, well-armed and well-trained, with siege equipment and cavalry. They're camped 15 miles beyond our eastern border, in the ruins of Raven's Hollow." The implications hit Aldric like a physical blow. Raven's Hollow had been a fortified city once, before it was destroyed in the war 30 years ago. If Demon had chosen it as his base, he wasn't planning hit-and-run raids. He was preparing for full-scale invasion. 3,000 men, Elira repeated, her strategic mind already calculating odds. "Against your current forces, we can field perhaps 1,500 in a pitched battle," Aldric finished. "Less if we need to maintain garrison forces to protect our cities and supply lines. Which makes the Valdris alliance not just politically advantageous, but militarily essential," Marcus added. "King Rodric's forces could tip the balance decisively in our favor, assuming he commits them to our cause rather than simply defending his own borders," Elira pointed out. "Alliances secured through marriage proposals are stronger than those based on mutual interest alone." Aldric closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the crown even though it rested in his chambers 2 floors above. Every path forward seemed to lead away from the woman standing beside him, toward choices that served the kingdom's needs while sacrificing his heart's desires. "Send word to King Roderick," he said finally, each word a small death. "Tell him I accept his proposal. Princess Catherine will be welcomed as my queen, and Valdris will have the alliance it seeks." "Your Majesty," Elira began. "And summon the War Council," Aldric continued, not looking at her. "If Demon wants a battle, he'll have one. But it will be fought on terms of my choosing, with allies of my making, backed by alliances sealed in the old ways that even ambitious brothers understand." As Marcus hurried away to carry out these orders, Aldric and Elira stood alone again in the treasury, the Queen's crown of thorns gleaming between them like a symbol of all the sacrifices love demanded of those born to rule. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I know." "So am I. Will you stay? Will you help me fight this war, even knowing that when it's over you'll belong to another?" "Yes, Aldric." "I'll stay. Because despite everything, I still believe you're worth fighting for, even if I can't be the one fighting beside you forever." In the growing light of dawn, they parted ways once again, he to prepare for war and marriage to a stranger, she to continue the research that might keep him alive long enough to enjoy either. The crown in its case watched over them both, beautiful and terrible in its reminder of the prices love paid in the service of duty. The secret garden had been Aldric's mother's pride, a hidden sanctuary behind the castle's eastern wall, accessible only through a door whose key had passed from queen to queen for 2 centuries. Now it served as refuge for conversations too dangerous for public spaces, its high walls ensuring privacy while its overgrown paths provided the illusion of accidental meetings. Aldric found Elira there as the sun reached its zenith, sitting on a stone bench beneath an arbor thick with climbing roses. She held a leather portfolio filled with documents and maps, but her attention seemed focused on something far beyond the papers scattered around her. "You've been avoiding the main halls," he observed, settling beside her with careful attention to proper distance. "Your courtiers make me nervous," she admitted. "Half of them look at me like I'm a fascinating curiosity, the other half like I'm a threat to the established order. Both groups ask too many questions I'm not ready to answer." "What kind of questions?" "Where I've been, who I've known, how I came by my knowledge of military tactics." Lord Pembridge seemed particularly interested in my travels through the northern provinces. Elira's voice carried a note of concern that made Aldric pay closer attention. He wanted specific details about trade routes and defensive positions that seemed more thorough than casual curiosity would explain. "Pembridge has always been ambitious. My father elevated his family to the nobility, and he spent 20 years trying to prove he belongs there through aggressive loyalty to the crown, or through aggressive intelligence gathering for someone else entirely." The suggestion hung in the air between them, adding another layer of uncertainty to an already complex situation. If Damon had allies within Aldric's own court, people positioned to feed him information about defensive preparations and strategic decisions, then the threat was even more serious than they'd realized. "You suspect him. I suspect everyone, because that's what survival in the northern provinces taught me. Trust carefully, verify constantly, and assume that anyone asking the right questions might be asking them for the wrong reasons." Aldric studied her profile as she spoke, seeing not just the girl he'd loved, but the woman those years of exile had forged. There was a hardness to her now, a wariness that spoke of lessons learned through necessity rather than choice. What else did those years teach you? That love is a luxury most people can't afford. That safety is temporary and security is an illusion. That the difference between surviving and thriving often comes down to how well you can read the motivations of people around you. "And what do you read in my motivations?" She turned to face him then, her brown eyes searching his features with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. "Conflict. You want to do what's right for your kingdom, but you're not entirely certain what that means anymore. You want to honor your duties as king, but you're tired of sacrificing your happiness for obligations that never seem to end. And you, what do you want?" "Things I can't have," she said simply. "A life where love matters more than politics. A world where good people don't have to choose between their hearts and their responsibilities. You without the crown and the weight it carries." "What if—" Aldric began, but stopped himself. The question he wanted to ask was dangerous, the kind that could reshape everything or destroy it entirely. What if what? What if there were another way? What if we didn't have to choose between duty and desire? Elira's expression grew cautious. "What are you suggesting?" "I don't know yet, but Princess Catherine is still weeks away from arriving for our betrothal ceremony. Demon's forces are gathering, but they haven't moved yet. There might be time to find alternatives to the choices that seem inevitable. Aldric, just consider it, please. Consider that perhaps the boy who carved our names in tree bark wasn't entirely naive. Perhaps he understood something about the nature of love that the king has forgotten in 30 years of being practical." Before Elira could respond, the garden door opened with the sharp creak of old hinges. Marcus entered, his expression troubled in ways that suggested more bad news from the borders. "Your Majesty, Lady Elira," he said with his customary bow. "I'm afraid I have urgent matters that require your attention." "More raids?" Aldric asked. "Worse. Captain Gareth has intercepted communications between Prince Demon's forces and someone within our own territory. We have confirmation that he has allies among our nobility, people feeding him information about our defensive preparations and troop movements." Elira and Aldric exchanged a meaningful look. Her suspicions about Lord Pembridge's questions suddenly seemed less like paranoia and more like prescient warning. "Do we know who?" Aldric asked. "Not yet. The messages were coded, and Captain Gareth's men only managed to capture fragments before the courier escaped. But the intelligence being passed includes details that only someone with access to our War Council meetings would know. Someone in my inner circle," Aldric said grimly. "Someone who sits at my table and swears loyalty while planning my downfall. There's more. Marcus continued reluctantly. "The hostages taken from Millhaven, they've been moved to Raven's Hollow. Prince Demon is using them as leverage, but also as bait. He wants you to come after them. Of course he does. A rescue attempt would require dividing our forces, leaving the castle vulnerable while giving him the chance to engage us on ground of his choosing." Aldric stood, pacing to the garden's far wall, where ivy grew thick against ancient stones. "What about the alliance with Valdris? Any word from King Roderick? He's agreed to your betrothal to Princess Catherine, but he wants the wedding to take place immediately, within the fortnight. He says the current military situation makes a quick ceremony essential to demonstrate the strength of our alliance." 2 weeks, Elira said quietly. "Not much time for finding alternative solutions. Enough time to identify the traitor in our midst," Aldric replied. "And enough time to plan a response to Demon that doesn't involve sacrificing innocent hostages or walking into obvious traps." Marcus cleared his throat diplomatically. "Your Majesty, there's one more matter. Lord Pembridge has requested a private audience. He claims to have intelligence about Lady Elira's background that might be relevant to our current security concerns." "What kind of intelligence?" Elira asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer wouldn't be pleasant. "He wouldn't say, sire, only that it concerns her activities during her years in the northern provinces, and that some of her associates during that period might not have been as innocent as they appeared." Aldric felt a chill that had nothing to do with the garden's shade. "Are you suggesting Lady Elira might be working with Demon?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Your Majesty. I'm simply reporting Lord Pembridge's claims. However, given our current situation, perhaps it would be wise to what? Question her loyalty? Doubt the word of someone who's provided us with crucial intelligence about our enemies?" Aldric's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Or perhaps Lord Pembridge's sudden interest in Lady Elira's background says more about his own motivations than hers." "Aldric," Elira said softly, "if there are questions about my past, perhaps I should answer them. I have nothing to hide, and your kingdom's security is more important than my comfort with scrutiny. You shouldn't have to defend yourself against vague accusations from ambitious courtiers. Maybe not, but I should be prepared to do it anyway. If Lord Pembridge has evidence of wrongdoing, let him present it. If he has suspicions based on rumor and speculation, let him voice them so they can be addressed openly." Marcus looked between them, clearly uncomfortable with the undercurrents of tension he couldn't quite identify. "Shall I arrange the meeting with Lord Pembridge?" "Yes," Aldric decided. "This afternoon in the council chamber. If he has accusations to make, he can make them in front of witnesses who can judge their merit. And if his accusations prove groundless," Elira asked, "then Lord Pembridge will learn that questioning the loyalty of the king's allies is a dangerous game to play." As Marcus departed to make the necessary arrangements, Aldric and Elira remained in the secret garden, surrounded by climbing roses and the scent of herbs his mother had planted decades ago. The afternoon sun slanted through the leaves, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed to shift with their moods. "Are you worried about what Pembridge might say?" Aldric asked. "I'm worried about what he might know," she replied. "There are things about my years in the northern provinces, connections I made, alliances I formed, that could be twisted to look suspicious if someone wanted to paint me as a threat." "What kind of connections?" "The kind that helped me survive when I had nothing but my wits and whatever skills I could trade for food and shelter. Some of the people I worked with weren't always on the right side of local laws. Some of the information I gathered wasn't always obtained through perfectly legal means." "But you were never disloyal to this kingdom?" "Never. Not once. Not even when staying loyal meant staying away from the person I loved most." "Then whatever Pembridge thinks he knows, whatever accusations he wants to make, we'll face them together. I won't let political maneuvering destroy what we've found again." Elira reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining, despite the risk such intimacy represented. "And if we can't find those alternative solutions you mentioned, if duty ultimately wins over desire, as it did 30 years ago, then at least we'll know we tried. At least we'll face our choices with full knowledge of what they cost." In the distance, Church bells began to ring the hour, calling them back to a world where kings made marriages for political advantage and queens wore crowns of thorns. But for now, in the secret garden where his mother had once found peace, they held hands and hoped that sometimes love could find a way to triumph over the practical demands of ruling a kingdom under siege. The council chamber felt smaller with tension, thick enough to cut. Lord Pembridge stood at the far end of the great oak table, his thin frame rigid with what he clearly believed was righteous purpose. Across from him, Elira sat with her hands folded calmly in her lap, though Aldric could see the subtle signs of strain in the set of her shoulders. "Lord Pembridge," Aldric began, his voice carrying the formal authority that discouraged interruption. "Marcus tells me you have concerns about Lady Elira's background. Present your evidence." Pembridge cleared his throat, clearly relishing his moment of importance. "Your Majesty, during my own travels to the northern provinces on trade matters, I encountered several individuals who knew Lady Elira during her years of exile. Their accounts of her activities paint a concerning picture." "What activities?" Marcus asked, quill poised to record official testimony. "She was known to associate with smugglers and information brokers, Your Majesty. People who traded in secrets as much as goods, who sold intelligence to the highest bidder without regard for loyalty or kingdom. Surviving in the northern provinces required making whatever alliances were available," Elira replied evenly. "When you have no family name to protect you and no wealth to ensure your safety, you learn to be practical about your associations." "Practical or profitable?" Pembridge's voice carried accusation wrapped in false concern. "My sources suggest you were quite successful at gathering information about local defenses, trade routes, and military movements. Information that would be valuable to anyone planning attacks against those same targets." Aldric felt ice form in his stomach. "Are you accusing Lady Elira of selling intelligence to raiders?" "I'm suggesting that her knowledge of attack patterns and defensive weaknesses might come from first-hand experience in planning such attacks," Pembridge replied. "Consider how conveniently she appeared, just as organized raids began against our borders. How perfectly her warnings align with threats that benefit from inside knowledge of our capabilities." "That's a serious accusation." Captain Gareth spoke from his position by the door. "Do you have proof of these claims?" Pembridge reached into his doublet and withdrew a folded parchment, its edges stained with travel and age. A letter written in Lady Elira's hand to a known smuggler named Tavish Brennan. It discusses payment for information about the old route south and mentions our mutual friend who remembers the old promises. The letter passed from hand to hand around the table until it reached Aldric. He recognized Elira's script immediately. The careful, elegant letters hadn't changed since she'd written their names in her childhood journal. "But the words, Elira," he said quietly. "What is this?" She looked at the letter, and something shifted in her expression. Not guilt exactly, but a weary resignation that suggested she'd been expecting this moment for some time. "It's exactly what it appears to be," she said. "A letter I wrote 6 months ago to a smuggler in the northern provinces, arranging payment for information about travel routes south to the capital." "You admit to paying smugglers for intelligence?" Marcus asked, his scholarly precision demanding clarity. "I admit to paying for information that would help me reach the capital safely, with knowledge that might save the king's life." Tavish Brennan wasn't just a smuggler. He was one of the few people in the northern provinces who remembered Prince Demon from before the war. A silence fell over the chamber, heavy with implications none of them wanted to voice. "Explain," Aldric said. "Demon didn't die at the Battle of Thornfield," Elira continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "He survived, badly wounded, and was carried from the field by loyal men who couldn't bear to see him executed for what they believed was a tactical decision rather than cowardice." "Executed." Aldric's voice was barely above a whisper. "Why would Demon face execution?" "Because the charge he led wasn't a desperate attempt to save the left flank. It was a deliberate abandonment of his post, designed to create exactly the kind of chaos that would allow enemy forces to break through. He was working with them, Aldric. He arranged the entire battle to weaken your position and eliminate rivals to his own claim to the throne. The accusations hit Aldric like physical blows. His brother, his younger brother, who had hero-worshipped him as a child, who had trained beside him, fought beside him, sworn the same oaths of loyalty to king and kingdom, a traitor from the very beginning. "That's impossible," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Too many pieces were falling into place. Demon's unusual knowledge of enemy movements, his insistence on leading the left flank despite his inexperience, the convenient timing of his death when investigations might have revealed uncomfortable truths. "I wish it were," Elira replied. "I've spent 15 years gathering evidence, tracking survivors, piecing together the truth of what happened at Thornfield. Demon orchestrated his own death to escape justice, then spent 30 years building a new identity and a new army while you mourned him as a fallen hero. The mutual friend who remembers old promises," Pembridge said, reading from the letter again. "You were referring to Prince Demon." "I was referring to the man I knew as Marcus Thorn, a wounded veteran who ran a trading post near the northern border. It wasn't until 3 months ago that I realized Marcus Thorn and Prince Demon were the same person." 3 months ago," Aldric repeated. "What happened 3 months ago?" Elira reached into her own robes and withdrew a different piece of parchment, this one bearing a wax seal that made Aldric's blood run cold. "The royal seal of Prince Demon, authentic and unmistakable. He sent me this," she said, unfolding the letter with careful hands. "An invitation to join his cause, with promises of wealth and position in the kingdom he intended to create after your death." Marcus leaned forward, his face pale. "What does it say?" "My dear Elira," she read aloud, "I know you have suffered much in the years since our kingdoms were torn apart by my brother's ambitions. I know you blame Aldric for the choices that led to your exile, the losses you endured, the life you might have lived if not for his selfish pursuit of power. I offer you the chance to reclaim what was stolen from you. Join me, and when I take the throne that should have been mine, you will have your revenge on the man who destroyed both our futures. The girl who loved a prince deserves better than the scraps a king might throw her way." The letter continued, offering specific details about Demon's plans and forces that confirmed everything they'd suspected about the organized nature of the attacks. But it was the final paragraph that struck Aldric like a sword thrust. "I have waited 30 years for this moment, sister by choice if not by blood. I have built an army, gathered allies, and positioned myself to take what was always rightfully mine. But I need someone inside Aldric's inner circle, someone he trusts completely, someone who can ensure that when the final battle comes, he will be vulnerable to the justice he has avoided for too long. Be that person, and I will give you everything you have ever wanted, including Aldric himself alive and powerless to do with as you see fit." "Sweet Mother of God," Marcus breathed. He wasn't just planning invasion, he was planning to use you as an assassin. "Which is why I came here immediately," Elira said. "Why I brought this letter as proof of his intentions, and why I've spent the past week reviewing your military records to understand exactly how he might strike." Pembridge's face had gone white as the implications of his own accusations became clear. "My lady, I had no idea. You had no idea, because you were looking for guilt where none existed," Aldric said, his voice hard with controlled anger. "You were so eager to find conspiracy that you nearly handed Demon exactly what he wanted: doubt and distrust among my closest allies. Your Majesty, I was only trying to protect. You were trying to advance your own position by undermining someone you saw as a threat to your access to power. In doing so, you nearly accomplished what 30 years of Demon's planning had failed to achieve." Captain Gareth stepped forward, his weathered face grim. "With your permission, Your Majesty, I'd like to review Lord Pembridge's own communications and activities. If we have one potential traitor among our nobles, we might have others. Do it, Aldric agreed. And Captain, take Lord Pembridge into protective custody while you investigate. If he's innocent of deliberate treason, he'll be safer under guard. If he's not, he'll find castle dungeons less comfortable than castle chambers, Gareth finished. As Pembridge was escorted from the room, protesting his innocence and loyalty, Aldric remained focused on the letters spread before him. 30 years of carefully constructed lies were crumbling, revealing a truth more painful than anything he could have imagined. "Why?" he asked Elira. "Why didn't Demon simply challenge me directly? He had legitimate claim to the throne if he could prove I was unfit to rule, because direct challenge would have required him to face you in honorable combat, and Demon was never brave enough for honor. He preferred manipulation and betrayal, the slow corruption of everything you built until your own kingdom turned against you. And if his letter had convinced you, if you had agreed to be his agent within my court." Elira met his eyes across the table, her expression holding depths of pain he was only beginning to understand. "Then you would be dead by now, and Demon would be claiming the throne as your rightful successor and avenger. But Aldric," she paused, her voice softening, "I stopped loving you 30 years ago not because I stopped caring, but because caring too much would have destroyed me. I could never have hurt you, no matter what promises of revenge or power were offered." The revelation settled over the chamber like dust after an explosion. Demon alive and planning invasion, allies within the court feeding him intelligence. A conspiracy that stretched back 30 years, built on lies and sustained by a brother's jealousy that had festered into something monstrous. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we prepare for war," Aldric replied. "Real war, not just border raids and political maneuvering. Demon has shown his hand, and we know what we're truly facing, and the alliance with Valdris." Marcus pressed. "The betrothal to Princess Catherine?" Aldric looked at Elira, seeing in her eyes the same question he was asking himself. With the truth finally revealed, with the real nature of their enemy clear, did the old choices still make sense? Did duty still demand the same sacrifices it had required when the stakes were different? "The alliance holds," he said finally, though the words cost him more than he wanted to admit. "Demon has 3,000 men and 30 years of preparation. I need every advantage I can gather, including King Roderic's armies. Even if it means," Elira began, "even if it means sacrificing my own happiness for my people's safety. Some things are more important than personal desire." But as he spoke the words, Aldric wondered if he was making the same mistake his father had made, choosing duty over love so completely that he forgot why. Either one mattered in the first place. The ancient war horn of kings hung in the castle's highest tower, where it had waited for 3 centuries to summon the kingdom's defenders to their final battle. Made from the horn of a dragon slain by Aldric's ancestor, it had been sounded only 7 times in the realm's history, each occasion marking a threat so grave that every able-bodied citizen was called to arms. Aldric climbed the winding stone steps in the pre-dawn darkness, each footfall echoing like a funeral bell through the narrow tower shaft. Behind him, Captain Gareth carried torches that cast dancing shadows on walls, carved with the names of kings who had faced their own moments of ultimate choice. Some had triumphed, some had fallen, but all had understood that leadership meant accepting the weight of decisions that could save or damn an entire people. "The preparations are complete, Your Majesty," Gareth reported as they reached the tower's apex. "All available forces have been recalled to the castle. The civilians from the outer settlements have been evacuated to the inner courtyard. Food stores and water supplies are secured for a siege of up to 3 months." Aldric nodded, though his attention was fixed on the great horn mounted in its ceremonial cradle. When blown, it would carry for miles across the countryside, reaching every farm and village within the kingdom's borders. It would summon retired soldiers from their hearths, young men from their ploughs, and anyone else capable of holding a weapon to the final defense of their home. "How many will answer the call?" he asked. "Perhaps 2,000 if we're fortunate. Farmers with hunting bows, Old soldiers with rusted swords, boys who've never seen real combat. Brave hearts, but not professional warriors. Against demons, 3,000 veterans. Aldric touched the horn's smooth surface, feeling the weight of history in its ancient curves. And still no word from King Roderick about when his forces might arrive. Princess Catherine's party is still a week away, sire. Her father promises his armies will follow immediately after the wedding ceremony, but armies move slowly, and Demon won't wait for our convenience. Aldric moved to the tower's eastern window, where the first pale light of dawn was beginning to show above the horizon. Somewhere out there, beyond the rolling hills and morning mist, his brother was making his own final preparations for a confrontation 30 years in the making. There's something else, Gareth continued reluctantly. Lady Elira has requested permission to accompany our forces into battle. She claims her knowledge of demons' tactics and strategies could prove invaluable. Absolutely not. Aldric's response was immediate and final. I won't have her endangered by what, Your Majesty? By the same battle that will endanger every person in this kingdom. Gareth's weathered features held a gentle challenge. With respect, sire, Lady Elira survived 15 years in the northern provinces. She's not the sheltered girl you remember from your youth. She's, Aldric began, then stopped himself. She was what? The woman he loved? The person whose safety mattered more to him than strategic advantages. The reminder of what he had to lose if this war went badly. She's the closest thing we have to an expert on Prince Demon's mind and methods, Gareth finished diplomatically. Captain Hayes agrees that her intelligence could be the difference between victory and defeat. Aldric closed his eyes, feeling the familiar weight of choices that pitted personal desire against royal duty. How many times had he stood at crossroads like this, forced to choose between what he wanted and what his people needed? Where is she now? In the war room with Marcus and Hayes, reviewing the defensive plans for the third time. She's identified 2 potential weaknesses in our formations that could prove critical if Demon's forces attempt the kind of coordinated assault she witnessed in the northern provinces. Of course she was. While he stood in a tower, wrestling with his fears about her safety, she was doing what she'd always done, focusing on the practical needs of the moment. Setting aside personal concerns in favor of larger purposes. The horn, he said finally. How long do we wait after sounding it before we can expect the first responses? Perhaps 2 hours for the nearest settlements, 6 hours for the furthest. By tomorrow evening, everyone who's coming will have arrived. Then we sound it now, at first light. Let every soul in the kingdom know that their king calls them to stand against the darkness. Whatever form it takes. Gareth handed him the ceremonial mallet, its handle worn smooth by the grip of 7 previous kings who had faced their own moments of ultimate decision. The weight felt heavier than any sword Aldric had ever carried, heavier than the crown that marked his authority. Your Majesty, Gareth said quietly, there's something you should know before you sound that horn. Lady Elira asked me to give you this when the time came for final preparations. He handed Aldric a small scroll tied with a ribbon that had once been blue but had faded to grey with age. The same ribbon Elira had worn in her hair on the day they'd carved their names in the apple tree's bark. Aldric unrolled the parchment, recognizing her careful script in the growing morning light. My dearest Aldric, if you're reading this, then the horn is about to sound and our final battle is at hand. I want you to know that whatever happens in the days to come, these past weeks have been the greatest gift I could have imagined. To see you again, to remember why I loved you, to understand the man you've become, it has been worth 30 years of waiting. I know you're afraid for my safety, just as I'm afraid for yours. But we both learned long ago that love sometimes means letting go of the people we care about so they can do what they must. You let me go once to protect me from the dangers of being close to a crown. Now I ask you to let me stay, to let me help you face whatever comes. Because protecting you protects everything I've ever cared about. You asked about alternative solutions, about ways we might choose love over duty. I think perhaps we've been asking the wrong question. Maybe the real choice isn't between love and duty. but between different kinds of love: selfish love that hoards what it values, or generous love that risks everything to preserve what matters most. I love you generously, Aldric. I love you enough to stand beside you in battle rather than waiting safely behind walls. I love you enough to risk my life defending the kingdom that shaped you, the crown that defines you, the people who depend on you. If we survive this war, we'll face the question of what comes next. If we don't, well, at least we'll have faced it together, as we should have 30 years ago. Your devoted friend, ally, and eternal love, Elira. P.S. The tactical adjustments I've suggested to Marcus and Hayes should give us the advantage we need, assuming Demon hasn't changed his preferred assault patterns since the northern campaigns. He was always too proud to modify a strategy that had worked before, and pride remains his greatest weakness. Aldric read the letter twice, then carefully folded it and placed it inside his doublet, close to his heart. Around him, the morning light continued to grow stronger, painting the eastern sky in shades of gold and rose that reminded him of Elira's hair in sunlight. "She's right, you know," Gareth said quietly. "About the tactical advantages, but also about the other thing. Some battles are worth fighting even when, especially when, we might lose everything that matters to us." "Sound the horn," Aldric decided. "Let every person in the kingdom know that their king calls them to stand against the darkness. And Captain, send word to Lady Elira that her request is granted. If she wants to fight beside us, she'll have that honor." "Aye, Your Majesty." Aldric raised the ceremonial mallet, feeling the weight of 3 centuries of tradition and the hopes of countless people who would hear its call. When he brought it down against the horn's surface, the sound that emerged was deep and resonant, carrying across the countryside like the voice of the kingdom itself calling its children home. The sound echoed from the hills, rolled across the valleys, and reached into every cottage and farmstead where people were starting their daily routines. In barns and workshops, in fields and markets, in places where ordinary citizens were living ordinary lives. They would hear that call and know that their ordinary lives were about to change forever. Some would answer immediately, dropping their tools and kissing their families goodbye before taking up whatever weapons they could find. Others would hesitate, weighing duty against fear, honor against survival. But enough would come. Enough to stand with their king against the brother who had betrayed everything they'd built together. As the horn's echoes faded into morning silence, Aldric remained in the tower, watching the sun rise over his kingdom. Somewhere out there, Demon was hearing that same call and understanding that the game of shadows and deception was finally over. The time for secrets and manipulation had passed. Now they would settle their differences in the old way, with steel and courage, and the kind of honor that could only be measured in blood. "Your Majesty," Gareth said, "the War Council is waiting. Final plans need approval, assignments need confirmation, and Princess Catherine's party? Still expected within the week. If we can hold Demon's forces for 7 days, the Valdris alliance will be secured, and our strategic position dramatically improved. 7 days. 7 days to hold a castle against a brother who knew its defenses intimately, who commanded professional soldiers against farmers and shopkeepers, who had spent 30 years planning for exactly this moment. 7 days to prove that love and loyalty could triumph over betrayal and ambition, that the bonds between a king and his people were stronger than the jealousy of disappointed princes. 7 days to discover whether the alternative solutions he and Elira had dreamed about were possible, or whether duty would demand the ultimate sacrifice from both of them. As they descended the tower stairs, Aldric carried with him the echo of the horn's call, the weight of Elira's letter, and the knowledge that the next week would determine not just the fate of his kingdom, but the answer to questions that had haunted him for 30 years. The final battle was coming, and with it, the chance to learn whether love was strong enough to survive the choices that war demanded. Aldric's battle-worn sword had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. a blade forged in the early days of the kingdom, when dragons still roamed the northern mountains and kings settled disputes with steel rather than treaties. The leather grip bore the impressions of 3 generations of royal hands, and the blade itself showed the nicks and scratches of countless battles fought in defense of the realm. Now, as dawn broke on the 5th day after the horn's call, Aldric drew the sword for what might be the final time. From the castle's eastern battlements, he could see demons' forces spread across the valley below, like a dark stain on the morning landscape. 3,000 men in formation, their armor gleaming in the early light. Siege engines positioned with military precision among their ranks. "They're beautiful, aren't they?" Elira said, joining him at the wall's edge. She wore leather armor borrowed from the castle's stores, a sword at her hip that she'd proven surprisingly capable with during the past few days of preparation. In a terrible sort of way. All that organization and purpose, all that deadly efficiency. Demon always did appreciate the aesthetic of warfare, Aldric replied, studying the enemy formations. Even as a boy, he preferred his toy soldiers arranged in perfect lines rather than scattered in realistic chaos. Some things never change. She pointed toward a cluster of banners near the center of the enemy force. There, the silver and black standard. That's where he'll be positioned, close enough to direct the battle, but far enough back to avoid personal risk. Still the same coward he was at Thornfield, perhaps. Or perhaps he's learned that dead martyrs make poor conquerors. Elira's tone was thoughtful, analytical. Either way, his position gives us tactical information we can use. Below them in the castle courtyard, the defenders made their own final preparations. Farmers checked the strings on hunting bows. Shopkeepers hefted unfamiliar swords. Retired soldiers shared their hard-won knowledge with boys who'd never faced combat. 2,000 souls, give or take, standing between demons' ambitions and the kingdom they called home. "Are you ready?" Aldric asked, though he wasn't certain whether the question was meant for Elira or himself. No one's ever ready for something like this. But I'm here, I'm armed, and I remember enough of what I learned in the northern provinces to be useful rather than merely brave. A horn sounded from the enemy lines, not the deep, resonant call of the kingdom's ancient horn, but a sharp military signal that set the siege engines in motion. Catapults creaked as their arms were drawn back, loaded with stones designed to breach walls that had stood for centuries. "Here we go." Captain Gareth called from his position coordinating the castle's defenses. "Archers to the walls. Prepare for bombardment." The first volley of stones arced through the morning sky like deadly meteors, crashing against the castle's outer walls with impacts that shook the ancient stones. Dust and debris rained down on the defenders, but the walls held. Built in an age when siege warfare was common, they'd been designed to withstand exactly this kind of assault. "Return fire," Aldric commanded, and his own catapults responded, hurling their loads toward the enemy formations below. The range was extreme, but several stones found their marks, creating gaps in Demon's perfect lines that were quickly filled by reserve troops moving forward. "They're probing our defenses," Elira observed, watching the enemy's movements with tactical eyes. "Testing our range, our accuracy, our response time. This bombardment isn't meant to breach the walls. It's meant to gather information. Information for what? For the real assault, which will come." She paused, studying the enemy formations more carefully. "There, do you see the infantry moving toward the northern approach? They're using the bombardment as cover to position assault troops near the secondary gate." Aldric followed her gaze and saw what she meant. While the siege engines drew attention with their dramatic assault on the main walls, companies of soldiers were quietly repositioning themselves to attack the castle's most vulnerable point, the smaller gate used for supply wagons and merchant traffic. "Marcus was right about you," he said, admiration coloring his voice despite the circumstances. "You do see patterns others miss. I see what I've seen before." Demon used this same misdirection tactic in the northern provinces, a loud, obvious attack to mask a quieter, more dangerous one. "Captain Gareth," Aldric called. "Shift half our archers to the northern wall." They're planning a secondary assault on the supply gate. Gareth didn't question the order, simply began moving troops as directed. One advantage of defending your own castle was that everyone knew the terrain intimately, could move through familiar passages and positions without the confusion that plagued attackers on unfamiliar ground. The bombardment continued for another hour, a steady rain of stones that gradually began to tell on the outer defenses. Cracks appeared in walls that had seemed invincible, and several of the castle's own catapults were damaged by direct hits. But the real assault began when Demon's infantry charged the northern gate under cover of the continuing bombardment. Now we see what farmers and shopkeepers can do against professional soldiers, Elira murmured. But there was pride rather than pessimism in her voice. The answer came in the form of a devastating crossfire from archers positioned exactly where they needed to be. Thanks to her warning, Demon's assault troops found themselves caught in a killing field. Their advance stalled by defenders who knew every stone of the ground they were fighting to protect. "First blood to us," Aldric observed, watching enemy soldiers retreat under the withering fire from the northern wall. "But they'll adapt. Try a different approach. Multiple simultaneous assaults," Elira predicted. "Force us to divide our defenders until we're too thin to hold any single position effectively." "It's what I'd do in his position." She was right. Within minutes, enemy forces were advancing on 3 different points: the main gate, the northern approach, and a section of the eastern wall where the morning's bombardment had created a potential breach. Aldric found himself running from position to position, sword in hand, directing defenses and fighting alongside farmers who showed courage that would have impressed professional soldiers. "Your Majesty," a young archer called from the eastern wall. "They're bringing up scaling ladders. We need reinforcements." Aldric looked around, assessing his forces. Already stretched thin across multiple defensive positions, he had no reserves left to commit. Every person capable of holding a weapon was already engaged, already fighting for their lives and their homes. "I'll take the eastern wall," he decided. "Marcus, coordinate the northern defense. Gareth, hold the main gate at all costs. Aldric," Elira caught his arm as he prepared to rush toward the threatened section. "Be careful. The eastern wall is where Demon will expect you to go. It's the most dramatic, the most visible position for a king to make his stand. Are you suggesting it's a trap?" "I'm suggesting that your brother knows you well enough to predict your choices. Don't let nobility make you predictable." But the eastern wall was crumbling under focused assault, and the people defending it were looking to him for leadership that couldn't be provided from a safe distance. Whatever trap Demon might have set, duty demanded that Aldric spring it. "Stay here," he told Elira. "Coordinate with Marcus. Watch for patterns I might miss. Like hell, I'm staying here." She drew her sword, its blade catching the morning light. "We fight together or not at all." Before he could argue, enemy soldiers were pouring through the breach in the eastern wall, and there was no time for anything but the immediate business of staying alive. Aldric's father's sword felt familiar in his hands, an extension of 30 years of training and combat experience. As he met the first attacker with a parry that sent the man stumbling backward into his companions, beside him, Elira moved with surprising grace and efficiency, her blade finding gaps in enemy armor with the precision of someone who'd learned to fight not for sport, but for survival. Together, they held the breach while farmers and shopkeepers rallied around them, inspired by the sight of their king and his lady fighting side by side against the darkness. The battle was far from over, but first blood had been drawn and the castle still stood. Whatever came next, they would face it together, as they should have 30 years ago. The broken crown of kings lay in 3 pieces on the blood-soaked stones of the eastern battlements, its golden circlet shattered by the impact of a mace that had missed Aldric's skull by mere inches. Rubies that had adorned the heads of his ancestors now scattered like drops of blood across the ancient stones, while the silver inlay that had proclaimed royal authority to the world was twisted beyond recognition. Yet somehow, The sight of his destroyed crown filled Aldric not with despair, but with a strange sense of liberation. For 30 years, he'd carried the weight of that golden circle, felt its pressure on his brow during every difficult decision, every choice between personal desire and royal duty. Now it was gone, and he was still alive, still fighting, still the man his people needed him to be. The crown, Marcus began, horror evident in his voice as he saw the destruction, is just metal and stones, Aldric replied, parrying a sword thrust from an enemy soldier who'd fought his way to the battlements. The kingdom isn't in the crown, Marcus. It's in the people willing to defend it. Around them, the battle raged with an intensity that spoke of desperation on both sides. Demon's forces had breached the eastern wall, but the defenders had rallied in the castle's inner courtyard, turning every doorway and stairwell into a fortress. Farmers fought beside nobles. Shopkeepers stood shoulder to shoulder with professional soldiers, united by bonds stronger than birth or station. "Where is he?" Elira asked, breathing hard from the exertion of combat. Her borrowed armor bore new dents and cuts, testament to how fiercely she'd fought in defense of walls that hadn't been her home for 30 years. Demon should be leading from the front now, not hiding behind his soldiers. "He's coming," Aldric said with certainty. This was never about conquest for him. It was about proving that he should have been king instead of me. He'll want to settle that question personally, as if summoned by his words. A voice rang out across the courtyard, familiar despite the decades that had passed, carrying the same imperious tone Demon had used as a boy when demanding attention from his elders. "Aldric, brother, enough of this charade. Face me like the man you pretend to be." The fighting slowed, then stopped entirely, as soldiers on both sides turned toward the source of the challenge. Prince Demon stood in the center of the courtyard, resplendent in armor that gleamed silver and black, his face bearing the lines that 30 years of exile and ambition had carved into features that still resembled the brother Aldric remembered. "You look surprised to see me," Demon continued, his voice carrying easily across the sudden silence. "Did you really believe the reports of my death? Did you mourn me, dear brother, or were you relieved to inherit what should have been shared?" Aldric descended from the battlements slowly, his father's sword steady in his grip. Around him, defenders and attackers alike formed a rough circle, understanding instinctively that this moment belonged to the two men at its center. "I mourned you," Aldric said simply. "I mourned the brother I thought I'd lost. The boy who used to follow me around the castle, asking endless questions about everything. I never mourned the man who betrayed his oaths and sold his loyalty to enemy forces." "Betrayed?" Demon's laugh was bitter, sharp. "Is that what you tell yourself? That I betrayed the kingdom, rather than recognizing that you were never worthy to rule it? Then why this? Why 30 years of hiding? If you believed your cause was just, why not challenge me openly, honorably? Because honor is a luxury princes can afford, but exiles cannot." Demon drew his own sword, a blade Aldric recognized, their father's ceremonial weapon, supposedly destroyed in the fire that had claimed the old armory. "Because I needed time to build forces, gather allies, become strong enough to take what was always mine by right." "By right?" Elira stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "By what right does treachery claim a crown? By what right does betrayal demand loyalty?" Demon's eyes shifted to her, and his expression changed, surprise mixed with something that might have been genuine pleasure. "Little Elira, all grown up and armed for war. I wondered if you'd received my invitation to join the winning side. I received it. I declined it. Some things matter more than personal advantage, such as love for a king who never chose you over his duty. Such as loyalty to a man who let you suffer in exile rather than risk his precious reputation." Demon's voice carried mockery, but also genuine curiosity. "Tell me, dear girl, what has 30 years of devotion to my brother earned you?" "The knowledge that some people are worth loving even when love costs everything," she replied steadily. "The understanding that true strength comes from choosing to protect what matters rather than taking what you want." Pretty words. "But I notice you're still not wearing a crown yourself. Neither are you." Aldric pointed out, raising his sword. "Shall we settle this question once and for all?" The duel that followed was both brutal and beautiful, a deadly dance between brothers who had learned their sword work from the same masters, fought side by side in their youth, knew each other's strengths and weaknesses as intimately as their own. Demon had always been the more technically skilled, his blade work precise and economical, but Aldric had 30 years of real combat experience. Battles fought not for personal glory, but for the protection of people who depended on him. Their swords rang against each other in the morning light, sparks flying as blade met blade, in combinations that spoke of shared training and divergent purposes. Around them, the watchers remained silent, understanding that they were witnessing more than just a fight. They were seeing the resolution of questions that had shaped a kingdom's destiny. "You could have shared," Demon said between exchanges, his breathing growing labored. "Father left the kingdom to both of us, remember? Joint rule, shared responsibility. But you wanted it all for yourself." "I wanted peace," Aldric replied, pressing his attack. "I wanted stability for our people, growth for our kingdom, safety for those who couldn't protect themselves. You wanted glory and acknowledgement and the kind of power that takes rather than gives. I wanted what I deserved. What you deserved was exactly what you got: exile and shame and 30 years of hiding from the consequences of your choices." Demon's response was a furious combination that drove Aldric back several steps, his blade moving with desperate speed. But desperation made him careless, opened him to the counterstrike that sent his sword spinning from numbed fingers. He fell to his knees in the courtyard's center, breathing hard, defeat written in every line of his body. Around them, his soldiers began laying down their weapons, understanding that their cause had died with their leader's surrender. "Well?" Demon asked, looking up at his brother. "Will you execute me publicly, as you should have 30 years ago? Will you finally claim the complete victory that's eluded you all this time?" Aldric stood over him, sword raised, and for a moment the courtyard held its breath. Justice demanded death, 30 years of treason, countless innocent lives lost to Demon's ambitions, the betrayal of every oath that bound brother to brother and subject to king. But as Aldric looked into eyes that still resembled the boy who'd once been his closest companion, he found he couldn't deliver the final blow. "Live," he said, lowering his sword. "Live with the knowledge of what you've done, what you've cost our people, what you've thrown away for the sake of pride and jealousy. Live with the understanding that you could have been remembered as a hero instead of a cautionary tale." "Mercy?" Demon's voice held disbelief. "After everything?" "Justice tempered by love for the boy you used to be. Captain Gareth, escort Prince Demon to quarters in the North Tower. He's to be treated with the respect due his birth, but he's never to leave those chambers without guard." "Your Majesty," Marcus protested, The people will see that their king values mercy over vengeance, redemption over revenge. Some victories are won not by destroying your enemies, but by refusing to become what they would make you." As Demon was led away, his shoulders bowed with defeat and something that might have been shame, the defenders began to cheer. Not the wild celebration of complete triumph, but the quieter satisfaction of survival, of home defended, of principles maintained in the face of terrible pressures. "It's over," Elira said, moving to stand beside Aldric among the scattered pieces of his crown. "This part is," he agreed. "But the kingdom still needs rebuilding, the people still need healing, and I still need to decide what kind of king I want to be, now that the crown that defined me lies broken on these stones." She knelt and picked up the largest piece of the shattered circlet, holding it up so the morning light caught the twisted gold. "Perhaps," she said thoughtfully, "it's time to forge a new kind of crown, one that represents partnership rather than solitude, shared responsibility rather than isolated authority. Are you proposing to help me rule?" "I'm proposing that some traditions might be worth changing, if you're brave enough to change them." As the sun climbed higher over the castle that had weathered its greatest trial, Aldric considered the possibilities that lay scattered around him, like the pieces of his broken crown. The old certainties were gone, but new ones might yet be forged from the materials at hand: love and loyalty, courage and sacrifice, the understanding that true strength came not from ruling alone, but from choosing the right people to stand beside you when the darkness came calling, the simple golden wedding bands caught the afternoon sunlight, streaming through the chapel's stained glass windows, their plain surfaces unmarked by the elaborate engravings that traditionally adorned royal jewelry. Forged from metal salvaged from the broken crown of kings, they represented something entirely new in the kingdom's long history, a marriage based on love rather than political necessity, a union that elevated partnership above protocol. 6 months had passed since the battle that ended Demon's rebellion. 6 months of rebuilding walls and lives, of healing wounds both physical and spiritual. The kingdom had emerged stronger from its trial, bound together by shared sacrifice and the knowledge that when darkness threatened, ordinary people could rise to extraordinary heights. "Are you certain about this?" Marcus asked for the 3rd time as he made final adjustments to the ceremonial documents. A wedding ceremony without foreign dignitaries, without elaborate pageantry, without the political alliances that royal marriages traditionally cement. "I'm certain that I want to marry the woman I love," Aldric replied, adjusting the simple blue doublet he'd chosen over elaborate royal robes. "I'm certain that our people deserve to see their king choose happiness over duty for once. And I'm certain that political alliances built on genuine partnership will prove stronger than those built on convenient marriages." King Roderick was disappointed when you declined his daughter's hand. From King Roderick will discover that trade agreements and mutual defense pacts serve his interests better than a reluctant son-in-law ever would have. Princess Catherine deserves a husband who can love her completely, not one whose heart belongs elsewhere. Through the chapel's open doors, he could hear the sounds of celebration from the castle's great hall, where nobles and commoners alike had gathered to witness what many were already calling the wedding of the century, not for its grandeur, but for its departure from centuries of royal tradition. "The bride approaches," Captain Gareth announced from his position by the altar, and Aldric felt his breath catch as Elira entered the chapel. She wore not the elaborate gown tradition demanded of royal brides, but a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her eyes, simple in design but elegant in execution. Her hair was crowned not with the ancient tiara of queens, but with apple blossoms from the tree where they'd carved their names as children, a living symbol of love that had endured through decades of separation. "You're beautiful," he whispered as she joined him before the altar. "You're biased," she replied, but her smile was radiant. "And you're about to become the first king in 3 centuries to marry for love rather than political advantage. Are you having second thoughts about marrying you?" "Never about becoming queen. I'll be again in a year when I've had time to discover whether I'm any good at it." The ceremony itself was brief and beautiful, conducted by Father Benedict, with words that emphasized partnership and mutual support, rather than the traditional vows of royal obedience. When Aldric placed the simple gold band on Elira's finger, it felt like the completion of something that had begun 30 years ago beneath apple blossoms in a secret garden. "By the authority vested in me by God and kingdom," Father Benedict intoned, "I pronounce you husband and wife, king and queen, partners in all things that matter. You may kiss your bride, your majesty." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and deep, carrying within it all the years of separation, all the choices that had led them back to each other, all the hope for futures they would build together. Around them, the chapel erupted in celebration, but for a moment they were alone, in the kind of perfect happiness that comes only to those who have learned to value it properly. "Queen Elira," Marcus said as they turned to face their well-wishers, and she tested the sound of it on her tongue. "It will take some getting used to," she admitted, "but I suppose I have time to grow into it." The celebration that followed filled the castle with music and laughter, as nobles who had initially questioned their king's choice found themselves charmed by his queen's intelligence and genuine care for the kingdom's welfare. Farmers and shopkeepers who had fought beside them in the battle shared tables with lords and ladies, the bonds forged in combat proving stronger than the barriers of birth and station. A toast. Lord Commander Hayes called out as evening settled over the festivities. To their majesties, who have shown us that love and duty need not be enemies, that the strongest kingdoms are built on foundations of partnership rather than power. The response was thunderous. Goblets raised throughout the hall as voices joined in acknowledgement of a truth that had taken 30 years to fulfill. As the evening wore on, Aldric and Elira moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and well wishes, but also taking time to speak with the farmers and craftsmen whose courage had saved the kingdom. "Your Majesty," said Willem the blacksmith, the same man who had stood with them on the eastern battlements, "my wife wanted me to tell you that our youngest daughter has been practicing her letters. She says she wants to grow up to be as brave as the Queen. Tell your daughter that bravery isn't about fighting battles," Elira replied gently. "It's about choosing to do what's right even when it's difficult. She's already braver than she knows, just by wanting to learn." Later, as the festivities wound down and guests began to drift away, Aldric and Elira found themselves alone on the battlements where they had first fought side by side. The castle's walls bore new scars from the recent battle, but also new stones where repairs had been made, evidence of destruction and renewal, of endings that became beginnings. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd stayed 30 years ago?" Aldric asked, his arm around her waist as they looked out over the kingdom they now ruled together. "Every day for the first 10 years, she admitted. "But I've learned that wondering about the past is less useful than planning for the future. We can't change what was, but we can shape what will be. And what do you want our future to look like?" "Peaceful, mostly. Prosperous for our people, secure from threats like demon. But also," she paused, considering her words carefully, "I want it to be remembered that once a king chose love over duty and found that love made him better at his duties rather than worse at them." The crown she spoke of was indeed different now, a new circlet forged from the metal of the old one, but designed with 2 interlocking bands that could be separated or joined as circumstances required. When they ruled together, the bands formed a single crown. When they ruled separately, each wore their own circle of authority. "There's something I need to tell you," Elira said, her voice carrying nervous excitement. "Something I discovered a few days ago but wanted to wait until after the wedding to share." "What is it?" "The royal physician confirmed it this morning. We're going to have a child." Aldric stopped breathing for a moment, the magnitude of her words settling over him like sunrise after the longest night. A child, an heir, but more than that, a continuation of the love that had brought them back together. "Are you happy?" Elira asked, uncertainty in her voice. "Elira, I'm terrified and thrilled and grateful beyond words. This child will grow up knowing that love is possible, that duty and desire can coexist." They stood together on the battlements as night settled over their kingdom. 2 people who had found their way back to each other across 30 years of separation. In the distance, lights twinkled in cottage windows where families gathered around their own hearths, secure in the knowledge that their rulers understood what they were fighting to protect. "Do you know what I love most about this moment?" Elira asked. "What?" "That we're not the same people who said goodbye 30 years ago. We're better, stronger, wiser, more capable of appreciating what we have because we understand what it cost. And what did it cost? Everything we thought we wanted, in exchange for everything we actually needed." In the distance, church bells began to ring the hour, marking the end of one day and the beginning of another. But for Aldric and Elira, it marked something more significant. The end of a long separation and the beginning of the life they had always been meant to share. The broken crown had been reforged into something stronger. The love that had seemed impossible had proven more enduring than duty or ambition. And in the months to come, a new life would begin, the next chapter of a story about choosing hope over fear, partnership over isolation, love over everything else. The boy who had carved names in apple bark and the girl who had loved him despite the weight of crowns had finally found their way home to each other. In that homecoming, they discovered that the greatest victories aren't won on battlefields, but in quiet moments when two hearts choose to beat as one. Their kingdom was safe, their love was true, and their future stretched before them like an unwritten book. It was exactly the kind of ending that felt like a beginning,